Yes. So good evening to one and all present here. I welcome all the members who are watching this webinar, and I welcome our today's speaker, T. Bhanushekar sir, all along from Chennai. We welcome you, sir, and thank you for accepting our invite to address our branch members. In fact, I was contacting sir 1 month before during the peak of the Corona time, but due to his busy schedule or something, we got his appointment right now, and thank you for accepting, sir. Yes, and regarding the queries clarification, you can at the end of the session you can unmute your audio and you can speak to the Bhanushekar sir directly itself, or if you want to type in the chat session, you can type in the chat session also. It's your choice like that. Since Bhanushekar sir is very famous and very familiar among the Madurai branch members, I hope we need not have any formal introduction about him. Over to you, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to all the delegates who are participating in this COVID seminar, because we call it a webinar. But I think this will become the order of the day with the COVID. And Chennai being central in so far as COVID is concerned, I think a lot of things are happening only through the web in Chennai so far. Well, friends, the topic for discussion, if I can put it very broadly, is with regard to representation for the appellate authority. I thought I will take it very slowly and very smoothly. I will give a beginning to the manner in which we will proceed. First of all, I don't propose to go by any set material. Material I have forwarded to the chairperson. I have also forwarded all formats of all draft petitions that are made by us before the various appellate fora with the chairperson already. And that, of course, can be shared among the delegates. Well, friends, I will not keep to a particular sequence, but I will try to share. The purpose of what I'm going to do is to share my experiences with all of you, so that we, at the end of the day, not merely get enriched on the law on the subject, but also on how the practice goes on the subject. Friends, I will start with the proceedings before the appellate authorities, but before that, I would like to draw your attention, the participants' attention, to two particular sections of the Income Tax Act, about which we need to be extremely careful even at the stage of assessment proceedings. Even at the stage of assessment proceedings. One is the provisions of section 124, which talks of the time limit within which an assessee can question the jurisdiction of an assessing officer. So if you are of the opinion that a particular officer does not have jurisdiction over the assessee, the time limit for questioning jurisdiction is mandated or stipulated under section 124, and section 124 provides that if you do not question the jurisdiction within the time stipulated in that section, then the assessee loses the right to question the jurisdiction itself during the course of appellate proceedings. So that is one area where one must be very careful. I am not going to really run you through the provisions of section 124, because that is not the purpose of this session. But then one will, appreciate that section 124 has very strict timelines. For example, where an assessee has filed a return of income, it says within 1 month from the date of service of notice under 143(2) or 142(1), or before completion of assessment, whichever is earlier. So, if one does not question the jurisdiction within 1 month from the date of service of the notice under 143(2) or 142(1), or before completion of assessment, whichever is earlier, the assessee loses the right to question the jurisdiction before the appellate authority. So this is one aspect where one has to be very careful about. So at least a semblance of questioning of jurisdiction has to happen at the time of the assessment proceedings. A similar caution has to be taken in terms of section 292B. 292B provides that one cannot question the non-service or the service within time or the manner of service of a notice after the completion of assessment, where the assessee has cooperated in the assessment proceedings. So if you are alleging that a particular notice has not been served on you, or if you are alleging that it has not been served properly, or if you are alleging that it has not been served within the stipulated time, then friends, it is imperative that you question it before the completion of assessment proceedings. Failure to question the same will entail the the loss of such right in the with the assessment. So of course, this limitation in 292B can apply only in a case where the SSC has cooperated in the assessment. So if the assessment is completed on non-cooperation basis under 144, then this right would still exist even in the course of appellate proceedings. So these are two sections which I thought one should be very careful about, because if these two are lost in the course of assessment proceedings, then probably they are lost forever and cannot be revived in the course of appellate proceedings. This is one aspect which I thought I will draw the attention of participants to. Now, going further, there are appealable orders, and there are orders which probably are not appealable. Now, if you go to section 246 capital A of the Income Tax Act, it lists out the appealable orders. Now, before I proceed further, as the chairperson put it, in case anybody has doubts, maybe they can raise their hands even during the course of my presentation, so that I could also add or subtract what I am saying, and probably that will give a lot more clarity to me and to the other participants also. Friends, so we have a list of appealable orders in section 246 capital A. So what is provided for in 246 capital A alone is appealable. So that is something that we need to remember. Alone is appealable before the Commission of Appeal. Of course, you have section 248, which also talks of an appealable order, which I will deal with. So the only exception to 246A is what is provided in 248, where an assessee denies his liability to deduct tax at source on payments made outside India. So you have section 246A, which lists out which are the appealable orders, but it starts off with saying where an assessee denies his liability to be assessed. So while the entire list of 246A is available, for example, 246A would refer to an order under 143.3, an order under 144, an order framed under 153A, etc., or an order framed under 271(1)(c) for that matter. All of these are appealable orders, but it may not specifically have reference to certain orders. But if you look at section 246A, it starts off with saying where a person denies his liability to be assessed. So a person's denial of liability to be assessed is enough for the order to be appealable. Now, the process of assessment is the determination of income, interest, and the tax payable, which alone may constitute an assessment. So if somebody is denying his liability to interest, say, then also we can say that an order is appealable, because though it may be an order framed under a section which may otherwise appear to be non-appealable, the provisions of section 246A starts off with saying where the assessee denies his liability to be assessed. So denial of liability. Now I'll give a small example just to make things clear. If one were to look at the provisions of section 234C, section 234C, it talks about a deferment in payment of advance tax, and insofar as it deals with deferment in payment of advance tax, you will find that section 234C provides for reduction of tax deductible or collectible at source. So let us assume my TDA, my liability to advance tax is 10,000 rupees or say 25,000 rupees, and let me assume that the tax deductible or collectible at source is 12,000 rupees. My balance is 13,000.
Yeah.
Some noise, madam. Yes.
Sorry, sir. Please go ahead. Yeah.
No problem. No problem. So, if my liability to advance tax is normally 25,000 rupees and my tax deductible is say 12,000 rupees, my balance of advance tax liability is say 13,000 rupees. Now, it doesn't matter that the tax deducted at source is only 10,000, because the language used in 234C very clearly says tax deductible or collectible at source. Now, while that is said, if one goes to the provisions of section 234B, one can see that it uses the words tax deducted or collected at source. So at first blush, it appears that what can be reduced for the purpose of 234B, that is the default in payment of advance tax interest, what can be reduced is only the tax deducted or collected at source, unlike section 234C. This is what it appears to at first blush. But then if one were to go very carefully into the provisions relating to payment of advance tax, which is contained in sections 208 onwards up to section 211, one can see that the requirement to pay advance tax itself is based on the figures after subtracting the tax deductible or collectible at source. So, though section 234B uses the word tax deducted or collected at source, one can interpret that 234B also will have to be worked out after subtracting the tax deductible or collectible at source. To take a very simple example, if you're a salaried employee and your entire tax is deductible at source, though the employer has not deducted tax at source, you will not have to pay any advance tax at all, and 234B will not be applicable to you. 234B will not be applicable to you, can be an argument. Now, in order to make this clear, I think that we can look at an example where tax has not been deducted but is deductible, and consequently interest is under 234B is not payable. And if one were to adjudicate this in appeal, saying that 234B is not leviable, one can see that 246A in the entire list does not talk about the payment of interest. Quantification of interest is not an appealable order. However, section 246A starts off with saying an assessee who denies his liability to be assessed. So here, where I am saying 234B is not leviable, I am denying my liability to 234B and consequently to that portion of the assessment, and possibly I can file an appeal against that order also. This is one aspect that I will make clear. At this stage, one may also notice that there is a section 248. There is a section 248 which provides that an appeal can lie against an order determining a person liable to deduct tax at source on the payments made outside India. I will come back to these two sections because these two sections have different time limits for filing of an appeal. Now, basically, to file an appeal, the basic requirements are that there must be an appealable order, which is contemplated either by 246A or 248, which we just elaborately discussed. And two, that the assessee should pay the fee that is payable before filing the appeal, where the assessee has to make the appeal maintainable. And three is that there must be there is a time limit to file the appeal, and the appeal has to be presented within that time. Now, that time limit depends on two circumstances. One, whether the appeal is to be presented in terms of section 248 or whether the appeal is to be presented in terms of 246A. If the appeal is to be presented in terms of 246A, friends, then the appeal has to be filed within 30 days from the date of receipt of the notice of demand. Within 30 days from the date of receipt of the notice of demand. Whereas, if an appeal is to be filed in terms of section 248, then the law provides that the appeal should be filed within 30 days from the payment of the tax. So, if you are denying your liability to deduct tax on a payment made outside India, you must first remit the tax into government account, and your time limit to start appealing or filing an appeal only starts thereafter. So, to that extent, there is a difference. Of course, there is also a requirement to pay taxes when an appeal is to be presented before the Commissioner of Appeal in terms of 249(4), which also we will discuss as we progress further. So basically, we are talking of an appeal which is to be presented within a stipulated time, along with the payment of a prescribed fee, and also along with the requirement that the appeal should be presented within a stipulated time limit. So if one does not file an appeal within the stipulated time limit, of course, one will understand the commissioner, or as the case may be, any appellate authority has the power to condone the delay in filing the appeal. Now, before I proceed into the procedural aspects of payment of fees, etc., I'm sure everybody is aware that an appeal to be presented before the Commission of Appeal is to be presented in form number 35 if it is an income tax appeal. If it is an income tax appeal, it has to be presented in form number 35. And that is presently to be uploaded. There is no mechanism to physically file a form number 35 today. It has to be uploaded. In fact, one question that has arisen is, in this context itself, what happened was, there was one commissioner appeal who said the form number 35 is defective. Please note, the form number 35 is defective and therefore dismiss the appeal of the assessor. Against this order, an appeal was filed before the appellate tribunal. The appellate tribunal said the appeal is defective, no doubt, but let the commissioner give an opportunity of rectifying the defect and thereafter proceed to decide the appeal. If the SC, rectifies the defect, then he may proceed to decide on merits or proceed in accordance with law. Now, in fact, we are wondering how to rectify this defect, because now we don't have a manual filing. We don't have a manual filing of an appeal. We have only what we call an e-filing of an appeal. And that e-filing does not permit, unlike a filing a revised return, it does not permit of filing a revised form number 35. So how to rectify this is a question. Of course, these are procedural difficulties which one may face. But coming back, please remember that the appeal is to be presented in form number 35. And please remember that we have appended to the form number 35 what is called a statement of facts and a grounds of appeal. Now, the grounds of appeal and the statement of facts, more particularly the grounds of appeal, are very, very crucial in disposing of an appeal, and substantial attention has to be paid to drafting the grounds of appeal, which are to be presented for the purpose of an appeal before the Commissioner of Income Tax. Form number 35, or I'll put it otherwise, the grounds of appeal forms the edifice. The grounds of appeal forms the edifice for the entire appeal, and the entire appeal virtually, revolves around. The appeal revolves around the filing of an appeal, and it revolves around the grounds of appeal that are presented before the Commission. So kindly note that great attention has to be paid. Great attention has to be paid to the aspect relating to drafting of the statement of facts and the grounds of appeal. I shall come back to some of the procedural requirements as we proceed, but for the time being, let me take this aspect. So, we are talking about various aspects relating to representation. The first starting, I will put it as the starting point for representation itself, is the drafting of the statement of facts and drafting of the grounds of appeal. More particularly, I will say the grounds of appeal that are presented before the Commission. Now, the grounds of appeal, in my opinion, should be kept as broad as possible and as crisp as possible. I have seen a tendency. I am not finding fault with anybody. I am only expressing what my thoughts are. I might be wrong, and I would love to be corrected. But I have seen a tendency among many of us, many SSEs, and sometimes even the councils, I should say, to draft very elaborate grounds of appeal, running into several pages. In fact, I would like grounds of appeal to be kept at the minimum, preferably within one page, and that too with adequate spacing. I am talking about one. And the grounds of appeal can be kept as broad as possible. Now, I just take small examples to make myself clear on what I am trying to say. Now, what I am trying to say is that, just give me a moment, please. Yes. What I am trying to say is that when a ground is drafted, it should be exhaustive enough to cover aspects which may come to our knowledge even later. For example, let us say that there is a reopened assessment. Let us say that there is a reopened assessment. I can challenge the reopening on the ground that a 148 was not issued to me. I can challenge the reopening on the ground that before proceeding to complete the assessment, a 143(2) was not served on me. I can challenge the reopening on the ground that it is a change of opinion. I can challenge the reopening on the ground that proper sanction has not been obtained before issuing notice. I can challenge the reopening on the ground that reasons recorded have not been properly done before reopening the assessment, and so on and so forth. So one reopening I can challenge on various grounds. So if I were to drop the grounds, I will simply say that the assessing officer failed to appreciate that the reopening is bad in law. I will not say for the reason that it amounts to a change of opinion, because if I say for the reason that it amounts to a change of opinion, then I cannot take into that ground or within the fold of that ground any other aspect on the basis of which I say the reopening is bad in law. So I will simply say the reopening is bad in law in my grounds of appeal when I present my written submissions. When I present my written submissions before the hearing or at the time of the hearing before the Commission of Appeal, I might specifically state what exactly is the reason why I am saying that the reopening is bad in law. So, friends, grounds being kept concise and wide is, in my opinion, always better than having the grounds made very specific and elaborate. Right? Likewise, for each and every aspect, one ground or maybe two grounds is sufficient. Again, there is a tendency to draw multifarious grounds, saying the same grounds in different fashions. For example, if I am saying that this disallowance ought not to have been made under, say, the provisions of section 37(1), all I need to say is that no disallowance was warranted under 37(1) in the facts and circumstances of the case. Or I can simply say no disallowance was warranted in the facts and circumstances of the case. That may even probably be sufficient for the purpose of saying that you can urge any aspect relating to the said disallowance. So A, I will first take a ground on jurisdiction. B, I will take a ground on every technical aspect, like for example, the reopening being invalid, etc. And C, I will take grounds on merits. Friends, when I am taking grounds on merits, again, there is one other aspect that I would like to share with you, which I have consistently used in my practice. We have always taken alternate grounds wherever we find it necessary or wherever we consider it appropriate. Now, when I say an alternate ground, I will take a very simple example. For example, the assessing officer disallowed a particular expenditure under which I claimed under 37(1) on the ground that the expenditure is capital in nature, let us say. On the ground that the expenditure is capital in nature. Now, in the course of my appeal proceedings, I will take a ground probably saying that the disallowance under 37(1) was not warranted in the facts and circumstances of the case. And two, I would say, without prejudice to my earlier ground, I would say that having held that the expenditure is capital in nature, the assessing officer ought to have allowed depreciation under section 32 of the Act. So A, I will say that the main claim is allowable, and B, without prejudice, I would say that an alternate ground is allowable by saying that depreciation should be allowed under section 32. Now, friends, there is always this doubt in the mind of everybody. Not that I don't have any of these doubts, only that, I also have these doubts, but I'm probably, trying to say that these are well worth trying because there could be other difficulty. Well, everybody gets this doubt, particularly the SSC, when you send the grounds to him, gets this doubt. We have taken a ground that without prejudice, section 32 is available. What if the Commissioner of Appeal adjudicates that ground, saying yes, section 32 depreciation is allowable, but does not adjudicate the main ground that the expenditure is allowable under 37(1). Friends, let me tell you that it is incumbent on the on the appellate authority it is incumbent on the appellate authority to first adjudicate the main ground. That is to say, in the instant example, he has to first adjudicate whether the expenditure is allowable under section 37(1). And only in a circumstance where he finds that the expenditure is not allowable under section 37(1), can he proceed to adjudicate the alternate ground? Can he proceed to adjudicate the alternate ground to say that the expenditure, though not allowable under 37(1), is exigible for depreciation under section 32. It is not open to an appellate authority to first adjudicate the alternate ground. The main ground has to be adjudicated, and only thereafter, on the failure of that ground, can the appellate authority proceed to adjudicate the alternate ground. So friends, again I will make it clear that raising of alternate grounds is a very important aspect when it comes to raising grounds before the appellate authority. Please remember, your representation may become ineffective when you don't raise a ground, and at the point when the matter is before the appellate authority, you find that his mood is against you in allowing the claim in terms of the primary prayer of, say, allowance under 37(1) in the example that we have just taken. So it is something which you need to be very careful about. You can couch it, you can say without prejudice, or assuming without conceding that it is not allowable under 37(1), depreciation ought to have been allowed under 32 is probably a language that you can use to demonstrate that it is an alternative ground. Or you can say, having concluded that the expenditure is capital in nature, the assessing officer alternatively ought to have allowed the claim of the assessee for depreciation under section 32. So make it clear that it is an alternate ground from the language that is being used before in the course of drafting the grounds of appeal. So insofar as the grounds of appeal is concerned, friends, remember, try to make it concise, try to make it as brief as possible, and try not to make too many grounds. Don't make your grounds argumentative. The more brief the grounds, invariably the larger is the scope for argument. In fact, I also have one more request when it comes to drafting grounds with all the colleagues in my office. I tell them, please don't cite case laws. Please don't cite case laws in the course of drafting the grounds of appeal. I can give you a small example. There is a reported decision in a case called Ford India, which I had argued before the income tax tribunal. Where I had argued before the tribunal. It is a reported case called Ford India. I don't remember the citation, but you can type it out and you can find it out on Google itself. Now there, the issue was with regard to allowability of warranty expenses. Allowability of warranty expenses. And insofar as allowability of warranty expenses was concerned, the assessing officer held that it is not allowable. This matter travelled to the CIT appeal. At the time when the matter was pending before CIT appeal, there were two conflicting decisions of the Madras High Court. One saying that warranty expenses is allowable, and two which said that warranty expenses is not allowed. There were two conflicting decisions. The Commission of Appeal, following the decision in favor of assessee, allowed the appeal of the assessee. The department went in appeal before the tribunal, and when the matter travelled before the tribunal, the department took a ground saying that the CIT appeal failed to appreciate the decision of the Madras High Court, which was against the assessee. They had specifically cited that decision. Now, by the time the matter came to be heard before the tribunal, the Supreme Court had already held that the Madras High Court against assessee, which was cited in the tribunal grounds of appeal, was not the correct decision. So the Supreme Court had reversed the Madras High Court, which was cited by the revenue in its grounds of appeal. So what happened was that the Supreme Court said that if warranty expenses is provided for on a scientific basis, it is allowable. So we took a plea that the Supreme Court is applicable. In fact, when the matter got called, I simply stood up and said the matter is covered by the decision of the Supreme Court. And I said this decision relied on has been reversed. So the bench looked at the department and said, is this reversed? They said yes. So immediately he said, okay, then we will dispose it of. The bench, the DR said, no, I have something more to add. He said, what? He started off explaining. They said, no, Supreme Court has reversed that decision, so we are following Supreme Court. And he said both sides agree. So this, citing of the decision itself came to my rescue, the citing of the decision by the department, and worked against the SSC. So remember, citing decisions is always a double-edged weapon, because you never know that decision exactly which you are citing in the grounds of appeal may get reversed before the matter comes to be heard in appeal proceedings, in which case the appellate authority is bound to be influenced by the fact that that decision is applicable, and it will become that much more difficult for an SSC. It would become that much more difficult for an SSC to explain that that decision is distinguishable, because it was you who raised that in your grounds of appeal, and now you are saying that decision itself is distinguishable. So that is something which I would always say should never be done. I have always been clear that grounds of appeal should not contain decisions which of any appellate authority, be it the tribunal, the High Court or the Supreme Court, because one thing I have realized is every decision is correct until it is reversed. Even Supreme Court decisions have been reversed by larger benches, and therefore best not to quote even any decision. That can always be used at the time of argument. At the time of argument, we can use those decisions. Likewise, if you look at the present Form 35 which is to be uploaded, remember that grounds of appeal cannot exceed 100 words. In fact, that by itself puts a restriction on the number of words an SSC uses in the grounds of appeal. Sometimes, I find that people don't use such long-winding sentences that it becomes difficult. So make your grounds of appeal very concise. Only 100 words per ground anyway is allowed. Likewise, statement of facts should also be very precise and concise. First of all, let us remember that form number 35 which is to be uploaded requires that statement of facts should not exceed 1000 words. So you cannot state too many things. But in the statement of facts, again, we make it very clear that we don't admit to certain facts unless we are sure of the facts. For example, the assessment order may say notice under 143(2) was issued. I may not be sure whether a notice under 143(2) has been issued or not at the time of drafting the appeal. Therefore, in my statement of facts, I will only say that the assessment order states that a notice under 143(2) was issued. I will not say that notice under 143(2) was issued by the assessing officer. I will say the assessment order states so that I at a later point can always say that no 143(2) was issued if need be. So these are some aspects that you need to bear in mind at the time of drafting the statement of facts and grounds of appeal. Now quickly to get to some procedural aspects. Remember that your appeal has to be presented within 30 days, and the 30 days is counted, as I said, from the date of service of the notice of demand or from the date on which you pay the taxes, if there is a liability to deduct tax at source on a payment made outside India, and where the appeal is to be presented in terms of section 248 of the Act. Now 30 days starts from the date of notice of demand, date of receipt of the notice of demand. So if your notice of demand is not received along with your order, and if your notice of demand is received, say, belatedly, then the time limit starts from the date of receipt of the notice of demand, not from the date of receipt of the assessment order. Now, while this is said, remember that 246A, or for that matter, even if you go to section 243, it's 253, I'm sorry, with regard to the appellate tribunal. It says any person aggrieved by an order. So a person who is aggrieved by an order can file an appeal. So what is required for filing an appeal is that you should be aggrieved by the order. Now I have situations where a partnership firm, a demand has been raised on the partnership firm. Let's say the firm has been wound up. You will also recollect that section 189 of the Income Tax Act presumes that a partnership firm is deemed to be in continuance for the purpose of determination of tax liability and performance of an assessment. And consequently, even though the firm is dissolved, it is even though the firm is dissolved, it is possible that an assessment order may be framed on the firm. In such circumstances, who should file the appeal? Who should file the appeal? The law provides any person aggrieved by the order. Now, you will also recollect that the liability of partners of a firm is joint and several. So, every person who is a partner of the firm, for the year for which the assessment is being framed, will become jointly and severally liable for the taxes which are determined in the course of that assessment. So just to take a quick example, a firm is dissolved. After the dissolution, an order is framed on the firm. Now you have to present an appeal. Who can present an appeal? Any partner of the firm can present an appeal, because every partner is jointly and severally liable. And since every partner is jointly and severally liable, it is imperative to understand that every partner is aggrieved. Every partner is aggrieved by the said order, because he is also liable for the tax. Now, proceeding, every person aggrieved by the order can present the appeal, against an appealable order, which is provided for in two forms. Now, at this stage, I will also draw your attention to one more very important aspect. Whether you want to file an appeal or not also has to be considered. Because when you talk about representation, you have to be very, very careful about every single aspect, because you should ensure that all the rights of the assessee are safeguarded in the course of the proceedings that he is going to take up further before any appellate forum or any other forum, as the case may be. Now, take a simple example of an assessment year 1780. You will recall that from assessment year 1718, no penalty is imposable for concealment or furnishing of inaccurate particulars of income under section 271(1)(c). Penalty is imposable in terms of section 270 capital A, and 270 capital A talks of two aspects. One is underreporting of income, and two is underreporting as a result of misreporting of income. I will not dwell too much into the aspects of penalty under 270A, because that is a separate session by itself. But then remember that penalty under 270A is going to fall under two categories. One is penalty for underreporting of income, and two is penalty for underreporting as a result of misreporting. So for the sake of convenience, we will say two kinds of penalty: one for underreporting, one for misreporting. For underreporting, the penalty is 50% of the tax, which is brought out as a result of the addition. And for underreporting, it is, while it is 50%, for misreporting, it is 200% of the tax. So if you say the tax rate is 30%, for misreporting it is 60% of the income. It is 60% of the income, because it is 200% of the tax. Whereas for underreporting, it is 15% of the income, because it is 50% of the tax. Please also remember that 270AA provides for immunity under or from levy of penalty under 270A, or 276C from prosecution, or prosecution under 276CC. So penalty under 270A prosecution under 276C or prosecution under 276CC. In all these three circumstances, there is a possibility that immunity may be granted under 270 capital A. Now 270 capital A3 also makes it 270 double A3 also makes it very clear that if there is a misreporting, no immunity will be granted. So if there is an underreporting, immunity will be granted. Now 270 AA also has one more condition. It has a condition that you should not file an appeal against the said order. So let us assume that in a particular order of assessment, the assessing officer finds that there is an underreporting of income. Right? The assessee has two options. Assessee can go to the assessing officer under 270 AA seeking immunity from penalty under 270A and prosecution under 276C or CC. Or he may choose to go in appeal under 246A. He may choose to go in appeal under 246A before the commissioner. Please notice that if one goes to a commissioner appeal under 246A, no petition can be made under 270 AA. So when you are representing before the assessing officer and when it comes to the next stage of advice, be very careful to advise your assessee on whether he should choose to go in appeal or not, because if he chooses to go in appeal, he is waiving his right to get immunity under 270 AA or vice versa. If he chooses to go under 270 AA against a particular order, he waives his right of appeal under 246A to go before the commissioner. These are mutually exclusive, and that is something again which we need to bear in mind. Now coming to the commissioner appeal, and once you have drafted your grounds of appeal, etc., we are going to be having to tackle with the payment of fees. Now so far as the payment of fees is concerned, it is very simple. It is dependent on the income assessed. If the income assessed is 1 lakh or less, then the fee is rupees 250. We have more than 1 lakh and up to rupees 2 lakh, that is 2 lakh or less, then it is rupees 500. Beyond rupees 2 lakhs, then the fee is rupees 1000. This is the fee that is to be paid for presenting an appeal before the commissioner. Failure to pay the fee may render the appeal itself invalid. Next, if you see particularly before the commissioner appeal, there is a provision called 249(4). There is a provision called 249(4) which requires that the assessee should pay the tax on returned income when return of income is filed before presenting the appeal before the commissioner. The assessee must pay the tax on returned income before presenting the appeal before the Commissioner of Income Tax appeal where he has filed a return of income. Where he has not filed a return of income, section 249(4)(b) provides that the assessee must pay an amount equal to the amount of advance tax before presenting the appeal. The assessee must pay an amount equal to the amount of advance tax before presenting the appeal is what is provided for in clause B of section 249(4). Of course, section 249(4) proceeds further to say that where no return of income is filed, the Commissioner of Income Tax appeal may, for good and sufficient reasons to be recorded in writing, exempt an assessee from the requirement of having to pay the amount equal to the amount of advance tax payable. So the Commissioner appeal may, for good and sufficient reasons, exempt an assessee from the requirement of paying the tax on the assessed income. That is only in a case where the assessee has not filed a return. If he has filed a return, even the Commissioner of Income Tax appeal does not have the power to exempt an assessee from the requirement of having to pay the tax on returned income. However, one thing that you may notice is that section 249(4) only talks of payment of tax on returned income, does not require the assessee to pay the interest on the tax on returned income before filing the appeal. So the failure to pay the interest on the tax on returned income will not render the appeal invalid. But if the assessee fails to pay the tax on returned income before filing the appeal becomes invalid. Of course, we have circumstances where the assessee has failed to pay the tax on the income returned before filing the appeal, but before the hearing has paid the same. In such circumstances, what would happen? We have told the Commission of Appeal that you may take the appeal as presented now, that is on the day on which the tax is paid, and then decide whether to condone the delay in filing the appeal or not. If you condone the delay, you proceed to hear the appeal on merits, otherwise dismiss it on the ground that the appeal is not, or the delay is not condoned. So we are talking about payment of fee. Now again, getting back to various aspects, the procedural aspects which we were discussing, the presentation of appeal, the payment of fee, the time limit, etc. Remember that the Commission of Appeal, or for that matter the tribunal or even the High Court or the Supreme Court, have the power of condoning delay in filing. And please remember that there is no restriction on the time that can be condoned. In fact, I had one case where I was before the tribunal where the delay was some 5 years or so. 5 years looks very simple, but then it is something like about 2000 days. 5 years and odd. I have appeals where the delay was 8 years, and even where the tribunal has condoned the delay. In fact, the reason given in one of the cases was we were pursuing alternate remedy. So, pursuing alternate remedy can be a good reason why delay should be controlled. I can explain this as I go further. But then remember that if there is a delay in presenting the appeal, then there is a requirement to upload along with the Form 35 a petition for condonation of delay. Remember that an affidavit also has to be presented, which is to be duly signed by a notary public, which may be presented at the time of the hearing of the appeal. An affidavit duly notarized may be presented at the time of hearing of the appeal. Now, when you talk of condonation, remember that normally condemnations are to be liberally construed, particularly when the condemnation is from an assessee. Condemnations are to be normally liberally construed. But having said that, appeals or condemnations must be delayed, appeals or condemnations must be liberally construed, you must also remember that it is incumbent on the assessee to state why there was a delay, and every day of delay must be explained. Every day of delay must be explained. So, for example, if you are saying that, please remember that you have 30 days to file the appeal. That 30 days, nobody can ask you a question why you didn't file the appeal. Starting from the 31st day, every day's delay must be explained. For example, if you are saying he's unwell for 2 months, then you must specifically say he was unwell for 2 months, what was the sickness, etc. Why you are saying that he could not present it. Thereafter, even after coming back, say for example, there could have been some problem, a family problem which he had, a marriage of his daughter to attend. You can say that the marriage of his daughter was to be conducted within 15 days thereafter, and he was busy with, making arrangements for the marriage. Of course, now during Corona, you cannot say much because only 100 people you can bring for a marriage itself. So making too many arrangements itself is wrong today. So you must make least arrangements as of today. No, I'm not even 100, I think it's 50. So you must make least arrangements today. In fact, what was all right 2 years, 1 year back is all wrong today. Last year I was telling my daughter, keep all your gadgets, keep your phone down, keep your thing down. All these gadgets are bad for your eyes. Now today she is studying only on that. All classes are going on only virtually. So now she is asking, Appa, last year you told me that these are all bad for you. Why this year it has become good? I said, Corona has made it good. That's all I can say. I have no other answer. But then friends understand that, you have to be very, very careful in explaining each delay. In fact, for one, there are a lot of decisions of the courts, like a very popular decision of Supreme Court in a case called MSP Katiji and Company, which talks about liberally condoning delays. But otherwise, normally, excepting for 1 or 2 decisions like this, Normally, I will not, in the course of representation, be tempted to use any case laws for condonation of delay. Condonation is basically a factual scenario. Please remember that it is very difficult, or I will even say impossible, to get a case law on a particular fact. Case laws are always on legal points. On factual issues, each case will speak for itself. So you must make out a case factually why there was a delay in filing the appeal. And every day's delay must be properly explained. This has to be uploaded along with the Form 35 in the condonation petition, and an affidavit is to be filed. An affidavit is to be filed at the time of presenting the appeal for the condonation along with the reasons for the condonation. Well, as I said, this is an extremely factual issue. It may depend on a case-to-case basis as to the reason why one is wanting that the delay should be condoned. Make it a factual issue. Make it very clear that these are the circumstances which was why the appeal was filed belatedly. Show why it was beyond your control. Show why it was beyond your control to present an appeal within the time that was otherwise allowed. Within the time that was otherwise allowed. So, as I said, condonation petitions again may have to be presented in an appropriate form for the appeal to be appropriately heard. Again, just for a quick recap, we were talking about the time limit for filing an appeal, the fees for filing an appeal, what are the appealable orders. We are talking about the decision of whether to file an appeal or not to file an appeal in terms of 270AA vis-a-vis 246A. We were talking about how grounds of appeal, how the statement of facts may be drafted so that they give you adequate leverage or leeway to argue any aspects that you wish to argue at the time of arguing the appeal. Now, despite all our best effort, it is possible that some ground may have been omitted to have been taken. Some ground may have been omitted to have been taken. Remember that omission of a ground is not normally fatal. You are at liberty to proceed to file additional grounds at the time of the hearing before the conclusion of the appellate proceedings. You are at liberty to file additional grounds. But normally, I will file an additional ground along with a prayer for its admission, saying that the additional ground is all based on material already available on record. The additional ground is already based on material already available on record, and the failure to file it was an inadvertent error, which may be pardoned and the ground may be adjudicated on merit. The reason why I do so is because of the decision of the Supreme Court in National Thermal Power Corporation, where the Supreme Court said an additional ground can be raised at any time, provided it is based on material available on record, where it has inadvertently been or has not been filed at the time of presenting the appeal. In fact, in that case, the additional ground was sought to be presented for the first time before the High Court, even which the Supreme Court said is perfectly all right. So, commission appeal is the first stage of appeal. I don't see much difficulty in presenting an additional ground at all before the commissioner. I don't see any difficulty in presenting an additional ground before the commissioner. Also remember that you have Rule 46A of the income tax rules, which provides for what is called presentation of additional evidence. Any material which was not available on record before the assessing officer in the course of proceedings before the assessing officer, if presented for the first time before the appellate authority, the Commission on Income Tax Appeals, has to be accompanied by a petition in terms of Rule 46A of the income tax rules. Rule 46A of the income tax rules requires that every additional evidence can be admitted only in 4 particular circumstances. There are circumstances that are listed out in Rule 46A, and only in terms of Rule 46A can additional evidence be presented before the commissioner. So be careful, friends, that if you are presenting any material, which is not before the assessing officer, if you are presenting it for the first time before the commissioner appeal, please ensure that it is accompanied by a petition under Rule 46A of the Income Tax Rules 1946. The reason why I am saying this is because if you will see the provisions of 46A, it is a very peculiar way in which it is drafted. It says that additional evidence shall not be admitted except, and provides for 4 circumstances where it may be admitted. So remember that technically no additional evidence at all can be produced first. Then the rule goes on to say except, and provides 4 circumstances. 1, where the assessing officer refused to admit the additional evidence. 2, where the assessee was prevented by sufficient cause from producing an evidence which was called for by the assessing officer. 3, where the assessee was prevented by sufficient cause from producing an additional evidence which was relevant for a ground of appeal. And 4, where the order was passed without giving an opportunity of being heard. So there are only 4 circumstances. A, the AO refused to admit. B, the AO asked for an evidence, you were prevented by sufficient cause from producing the same. C, the AO did not ask for the evidence, but you wanted to produce, but you were prevented from producing, though it was relevant to the ground of appeal. And lastly, the order was passed without giving an opportunity of being heard to the assessor. There are 4 circumstances in which additional evidence can be produced. So in your petition for admission of additional evidence, clearly state what is the additional evidence you are seeking to produce. Clearly state how it is relevant for the disposal of the appeal and how it is very important or crucial for disposal of the appeal. And most importantly, state why it should be admitted. In other words, under which of the 4 clauses that I just mentioned you fall under. That is, a failure to produce it because there was a refusal on the part of the AO. You were called for to produce but could not be produced for sufficient cause. It is relevant to the grounds but could not be produced due to sufficient cause or due to good reasons that you are prevented by sufficient cause. And 4, you are not given an opportunity. State which of the clauses you fall under and state that the additional evidence may be admitted and justice be rendered. Because you must state 3 things. 1, what is the additional evidence? 2, why you are not able to produce it and how it is crucial. And 3, under which clause of 46A, Rule 46A you fall under for the additional evidence to be proceeded with. So all these 3 are crucial in terms of presenting an additional evidence. Please do not produce evidences which are not before the lower authorities without specifically a petition in terms of Rule 46A. Because Rule 46A also provides that if additional evidences are presented by an assessee, then those additional evidence must be put across to the assessing officer. He must be given an opportunity of being heard, and only thereafter orders should be passed. Friends, I'll pause here for a moment. I will just join in a minute. There seems to be a little bit of problem with my net. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Am I audible? Madam, I can't hear you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible. Yeah.
Oh. Now, I was talking about presenting evidences before the Commission of Appeal, divided into two categories. One, which are already available before the AO, and two, what is not available with an AO with a petition in terms of Rule 46A, because 46A(3) specifically provides that if an evidence is presented by the assessee, an opportunity of being heard must be given to the assessing officer before proceeding to entertain that evidence and proceeding to decide on the basis of that evidence. So that petition may become imperative, so that there is no difficulty at a later point. Now, I was talking about the aspect relating to 270AA in the context of 270A, where I was talking about underreporting. And I said one has to be careful to see whether the appeal should be presented or not, because if you present an appeal, you cannot go under 270A. There are two other aspects that one must keep in mind. Remember that the Commissioner of Income Tax Appeal has the power to enhance an assessment. Remember that the Commissioner of Income Tax Appeal has the power to enhance an assessment, which power, of course, is not available with the tribunal. Which power is not available with the tribunal, but the Commissioner of Income Tax Appeal can enhance an assessment. So you must be very careful. If you are running the risk of enhancement, probably the best thing is to maybe to avoid filing an appeal also. Of course, the Commissioner of Appeal's powers are restricted in the sense that he cannot, invent or discover a new source of income. He can only travel to enhance in respect of such source of income that have been considered by the assessing office. Also remember that there is an alternative to an appeal under 246A in certain circumstances, where an assessee can choose application under 264 for a revision instead of going in appeal before the commissioner. Now, it is sometimes possible that a revision under 264 may also be a good remedy. Remember that if you choose to file an appeal, you cannot choose your remedy of appeal of revision at all. For this proposition, you have a decision of the Supreme Court in Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, where the Supreme Court has held that if one chooses to file an appeal, then against that very order, it is not possible. It is not possible to choose to file a revision, right? So you must also decide whether you want to go in revision under 264. Remember, 264 is fairly more time bound. You will have to present your application within 1 year. The commissioner has to decide the revision petition which is presented by you within another 1 year. So it will get over within a stipulated time. Commission appeal may extend because there is no time limit. It says wherever possible dispose of an appeal. That's the time limit. That is only some kind of a discretionary time limit, not a mandatory time. So you may have to exercise that caution also to ensure that there is adequate, application of mind on whether to go under 264. See, for example, some aspects which have not been properly considered by AO. Sometimes you may think just a 264 is a better remedy. So you may choose to go under 264. But remember that if you file an appeal under 246A, you cannot file a 264 petition. Likewise, also remember that a 264 order is non-appealable. You can only go on a writ petition before the High Court. There is no appeal that lies against the 264. These are aspects that again have to be borne in mind before one decides whether to proceed with the appeal. Now, friends, we are talking about the various nuances in presenting an appeal and in representing before the Commission of Appeal. Now, likewise, when one were to draft written submission, I would think that the written submission should be subdivided ground-wise, saying ground 1 and 2. These are the submissions that are being made, so that while adjudication also it may be easier for the Commissioner of Appeal to dispose of the appeal ground-wise, because actually speaking, he is under an obligation to dispose of every ground, which he can do only possibly if he does it ground-wise. Second is, if there is a submission which is very elaborate and which is very long-winding, then I would also suggest one makes what I call an executive summary or a small summary of the submission, so that, which is more maybe 2 pages or so that it is easier for a discussion before the commissioner. It is easier for a discussion before the commissioner. There is nothing to say that you must make a written submission. There is nothing to say that you must make executive summary of your written submission, etc. But I would only suggest or say that it is advisable and easier if one were to prepare written submissions, and also wherever necessary prepare an executive summary of the written submissions, so that it is possible for the assessee to proceed to have his appeal disposed of more properly or in a better fashion, rather than later on repent saying these aspects have not been considered, etc. Please remember that it becomes easier to demonstrate before a higher forum in case we are unsuccessful, that certain aspects which we have given in the grounds and which we have given in our arguments by way of written submissions have not been considered by the commissioner. Remember that the commissioner appeal does not have the power of set aside, but he can do what is called calling for a remand report, whereby he calls for a report from the assessing officer, which is normally based on the evidences that are presented before him, and more often with reference to additional evidences that are presented before him. We have spoken about various aspects relating to the commissioner. Now, for the time being, you must also remember that there is a decision, interesting decision of the Supreme Court in a case called Goetz India, where the Supreme Court held that an additional or any additional claim cannot be entered into or gone into by the assessing officer, except where it is made through a revised return. So the commissioners, the assessing officers generally quote this Goetz India and say, if you make a fresh claim, then we cannot entertain this unless you have filed a revised return. Now please remember that this does not apply to the appellate authorities. In fact, if you read the last line of the decision of the Supreme Court, the last line of the decision of the Supreme Court in Goetz India, there itself it very clearly says it does not apply to appellate authorities. You also have a decision of the Delhi High Court in a case called J Parabolic. Where the Delhi High Court has held that this restriction on making fresh claims may not apply to appellate authorities, though it may apply to an assessing officer. In other words, Goetz India only binds an assessing officer from admitting an additional claim, except through a revised return, but does not place any restriction on appellate authority in proceeding to decide an additional claim, which is made through the appellate or made during the course of the appellate. So, if there is an additional, claim to be made, that may also be raised in the grounds of appeal. Friends, before I proceed, let me make it very clear that all these I have already circulated to the chairperson. So the case laws are available with the chairperson, which I presume the chairperson will share with all of you, which should be done very comfortably, your mail ID being available. Correct, madam?
Yes, sir. I will be circulating, sir, at the end of the session.
Now, importantly, one more thing. I would suggest that wherever you require any evidences which are available with the assessing officer, like for example, an investigation report, or like for example, a statement from any third person which may have been collected by the assessing officer, please make it very clear to the appellate authority, the commissioner appeal, that these, if they have not been given to you, have not been given to you. Also state your claim for cross-examination. At this stage, I will probably draw your attention to two important decisions. Of course, though not directly connected with what I am now stating, two very important decisions. One is reported in 30 ITR 181, 30 ITR 181, the Supreme Court, and the other is reported in 33 ITR, 33 ITR 786, 786, the Allahabad High Court. Now, in both of these decisions, the Supreme Court and the Allahabad High Court respectively held that an affidavit is a very, very important piece of evidence, and if the statements of the affidavit are not countered or found to be wrong or incorrect, then the contents of the affidavit are presumed to be true and correct. In other words, if I present an affidavit before a commissioner of appeals stating certain facts, and if that is not countered to be wrong, then the contents of the affidavit are always deemed to be correct. Likewise, remember that your right of cross-examination is a very important thing. Normally, there is something called an examination and a cross-examination. An examination is done when you are producing a witness before the authorities concerned. And cross-examination is done of a witness of the other side. So if the assessing officer is taking a statement from me and using it against you, then you have a right to cross-examine me. Please remember that if any witnesses are to be presented, please make it clear that you wish to present these witnesses, and you may also request the concerned authority to issue summons to the witnesses to be present. You don't have to personally ensure that they are present. You can request the authority to issue summons to require them to be present. B, if it is the witness of the revenue, then ensure that if need be, you will ask for cross-examination. Of course, I am also wary of the fact that sometimes cross-examination itself can work against you. But then, if you need cross-examination, please ensure that you ask for cross-examination. While I say this, please also remember that cross-examination, if you so wish, can be done by a third party. It is not necessary that the SC should do it, or for that matter, you as an authorized person should do it, as the authorized representative or person needs to do. You can even have it done through one other person to whom you can give the proper authorization. Normally, the ideal person is to engage some person, some advocate who is practicing on the criminal side. They are the best persons to cross-examine. They will ask 10 questions, at the end of it, have the answer what they want only from the mouth of the person. So wherever necessary, engage the services of an advocate also if we consider appropriate. Again, all of us are aware if the last day happens to be an holiday, an appeal can be presented on the next day, even without there being a delay. But with the concept of e-filing, that may no longer be relevant, because even if today is a Saturday or a Sunday, being a holiday, you are at liberty to upload the appeal. The holiday is only for the government of India. The holiday is never for us or for the assessee. So you can always upload the appeal. And therefore, if you present the appeal later, there might be a delay. Now, I will quickly move on to the tribunal. For some time, I will deal with the tribunal and then deal with certain general aspects. Now, insofar as tribunal is concerned, the question of a statement of facts does not arise. The question of a statement of facts does not arise. And an appeal is to be presented within 60 days from the date on which the order passed is received by the assessor. The order could be passed by the Commissioner of Appeal. The order could be passed by the CIT or PCIT under section 263, which is the revision order, or the appeal could be presented against a denial of 80G, a denial of 1023C, a denial of 12AA, any of these, or the new 12AB is also added. So on failure, or when you are aggrieved by an order under 263, when you are aggrieved by an order denying your 12AA or 12AB or 1023C or 80G, or where you are aggrieved by an order of a Commissioner of Appeal, you can present an appeal before the tribunal. Now, there are two parties normally in appeal before the tribunal. Before the commission of appeal, normally there will only be one party, which will be the SC. Though technically an assessing officer is also one party, he need not or he does not normally make himself present. But before the tribunal, invariably the assessing officer is represented by whom we call the departmental representative or the DR. Remember that 60 days is the time to present an appeal. Of course, delay can be condoned by the same logic that I said with regard to the commissioner appeal will apply with regard to tribunal also. There is no problem. The time limit which can be condoned is not restricted. It is any length of time that can be condoned, but provided a reasonable cause is given for explaining why there was a delay in filing the appeal. You remember again that there is a fee to be paid for presenting an appeal before the tribunal also. The fee, of course, is slightly different. Where the income assessed is 1 lakh or less, the fee is rupees 500. Beyond 1 lakh and up to 2 lakh, the fee is rupees 1,500. Beyond 2 lakh, and the fee is 1% of the income assessed, subject to a maximum of 10,000. This is the fee that is to be payable. The failure to pay the fee may make the appeal one which is infructuous or which is liable to be dismissed. Remember that the fee has to be paid in the column others, self-assessment tax others, and you have to enclose proof that you have paid it across that column while filing the appeal before the tribunal. Again, as I said, with regard to the commission appeal, concise grounds are to be filed. No statement of facts are required. Grounds should be, as broad as possible. Alternate grounds will be taken, etc. All these things. But before I proceed further, friends, remember that there is a possibility that you may have a loss assessed. In such cases, what is the fee that is payable? Now, there are decisions of the courts where the courts have held that if it is a loss assessed, then you only need to pay the minimum fee. That is 250 in the case of commission appeal and 500 in the case of tribunal. 250 in the case of commission appeal and 500 in the case of tribunal. Now, both before the commission appeal and before the tribunal, remember that while fixing the fee, the law also provides that if the appeal has no relevance to the income assessed, then the fee payable is the minimum fee. Where the appeal has no relevance to the income assessed, the fee that is payable is the minimum fee. For example, if there is a TDS failure, you are held to be an assessee in default under 201. You want to file an appeal against the 201 order, then the fee payable will be only rupees 250 or as case maybe 500 because it has got no relevance to the income assessed. Likewise, the courts have held that if it is a penalty appeal, 271 1C penalty or for that matter 270A penalty, then the fee that is payable is only the minimum fee, that is 250 or as the case may be 500. So income assessed includes, that cannot be said to be including loss assessed. Loss assessed, you pay the minimum fee only. You pay the minimum fee only. Also remember one more aspect for the tribunal, one more aspect with relevance to the tribunal is that the fee that is payable on the income assessed. So let me take a simple example. As you all know, if the income assessed is between 1 lakh and 2 lakh, the fee for the tribunal is 1,500. If it is up to 1 lakh, the fee is rupees 500. Now let us assume you returned an income of say 80,000. The assessing officer determined the income at say 1.5 lakh. You determined an income of 80,000. The assessing officer determined the income at 1.5 lakh. The fee that is payable before the commission of appeal is no problem, 500. Income assessed 1,50,000. The slab rate will fall under 500, no difficulty. Now let's assume the commission appeal out of this 1,50,000, that is you returned 80, the assessing officer added 70 and made it 150. Out of this 150 deletes 60. Now you want to go in appeal against that order of the Commission of Appeal because still 30,000 addition has been or 20,000 appeal has been sustained. You want to go in appeal against that order. What is the fee payable? The fee payable will not be based on your revised income, which is to be determined by the assessing officer giving effect to the appellate order. The fee payable will depend on your income assessed. Your income assessed was 1,50,000. Most of it might have gone in the course of the first appeal proceeding. But still your fee payable is dependent on that, which means you have to pay 1,500 rupees fee in the instant account. I just took this as an example to illustrate that the fee is payable on the basis of not the income after giving effect to the Commission of Appeals order, but on the basis of the income. On the basis of the income that is determined by the assessing officer in the course of the assessment proceeding. Now, before the tribunal again, things become a little more formal because they are proceedings which are held normally in open court. Of course, now we are going through virtual court proceedings. Just like, you know, we are going through virtual webinars and seminars and whatnot. We are going through virtual court proceedings. Sometimes it is quite nice to go through these. Sometimes it becomes very difficult because sometimes the voice breaks. It becomes a little difficult. You have not heard the other side. And twice if you ask, I am sorry, they also sometimes tend to get agitated because they don't realize that the audio is of talk. Likewise, referring to page numbers, supposing I have filed a paper book comprising of 180 pages, then referring to pages, referring to case laws, referring to page numbers, paragraphs becomes difficult. And most importantly, the body language of the members is not so visible because you're looking at them at a distance. So virtual proceedings makes it a little more tricky, but I'm not, this probably will not or should not last too long because this morning I was reading on the paper saying that somebody, AstraZeneca, says that they will definitely come out with a vaccine within the next 4 months, which looks quite heartening. So they will come out with the vaccine within the next 4 months, and they are not only doing that, they are saying we are proceeding to manufacture the vaccine even while testing the efficacy, which means they are saying in 4 months, India, Serum Institute India alone would have produced 400 billion units of the vaccine. So probably things may change over the next 4 months, but till then the mask will become the rule. In fact, nowadays we are seeing how people are wearing matching masks. You know, many companies have started making that a USP, saying we are selling matching masks. Well, be that as it may, it has become a little more difficult in the context of, you know, the virtual proceedings. But since they may be very short-lived, I'm not looking at that as a basis. I'm looking at the normal, real proceedings that happen. So the normal real proceedings, whoever is the party who has presented the appeal normally stands up and argues his case first. The respondent in the appeal argues his case second. This is the general and normal rule. At this stage, I will explain about something called a cross objection. Something called a cross objection. The Income Tax Appellate Tribunal rules in Rule 27 provides that the respondent in an appeal may urge any grounds that has been held against him by the Commission of Appeal, or may support the order of the Commission of Appeal on any grounds that have been held against him. And the very same rules also talk about what is called a cross objection. Now remember that the respondent in an appeal can, in respect of any ground held against him, I am using words with great care, the respondent in an appeal may, in respect of any grounds held against him, find what is called a cross objection, and there is no fee for presenting the cross objection. There is no fee for filing the cross objection. The respondent may file a cross objection. In respect of any ground held against him, please note, if no ground has been held against you, there is no right to file cross objection. There is no need to file cross objection. Again, many SSCs file what is called a supportive cross objection, saying the same thing the commissioner said in the order of assessment itself. That is absolutely not necessary. In fact, I will even go to the extent of saying that is not at all permitted by the law. The provisions of law do not at all permit filing a cross objection when all grounds are held in your favor. There is nothing called a supportive cross objection. So if there is any ground held against you, you may file a cross objection. Otherwise, you may keep quiet. Now, again going further, remember that a cross objection itself, you see the language used in the law, it says that a cross objection shall be deemed to be an appeal and shall be disposed of accordingly. So remember that a cross objection itself is an appeal. I'll come back to why I am saying this a little late. But please remember that a cross objection is an independent appeal and shall be disposed of accordingly. Now, a little while earlier, I said that normally it is the appellant who proceeds to represent his appeal first. Now, remember, let's take a case like this. Before the Commission of Appeal, I argue saying that the reopening is bad in law, and without prejudice, I say in any case, this addition is not warranted in law. The Commission of Appeal holds that the reopening is valid, but holds that the addition need not or should not have been made. Now, I am not agreed with the order because the addition has been fully deleted. I don't file an appeal. The department files an appeal saying the addition is correctly made. Against this appeal, I can file what is a cross objection. Now, the cross objection has to be filed within 30 days from which the appeal is communicated to the respondent. Within 30 days from the date on which the appeal is communicated to the respondent is the time limit for presenting a cross objection. Now, in the cross objection, you may say the reopening is bad in law. Now, if your cross objection goes to the root of the matter, then procedurally the tribunal requires that the cross objector should start representing the appeal proceeding, because it goes to the root of the matter. Because if the tribunal is able to say the reopening is bad in law, then the rest of the aspects may or may not be gone into at all. May or may not be gone into at all. So remember that there is something called a cross objection that may be filed, and if you want to file, you should file it only when any ground has been held against you, or if a ground has not been adjudicated. If all grounds have been held in your favor, there is no need for a cross objection. Also remember Rule 27 of the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal rules. It is a very, very important rule, where the rule provides that the respondent to an appeal may support an order of the Commission of Appeal on any ground held against him, which means that the respondent gets a right to urge anything. So even if you don't file a cross objection in the example that I gave, you can still argue that the reopening is bad in law through rule number 27 itself of the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal. In fact, there is a very interesting decision of the Indore bench of the tribunal in a case called Turquoise Investments Limited. The very same decision in Turquoise Investments was upheld by the Madhya Pradesh High Court and again upheld by the Supreme Court, where the court said that that Rule 27 permits you to urge anything which is in your favor, even in the course of appellate proceedings before the tribunal, even in the absence of a cross objection. So you may file a cross objection, even a failure to cross objection will not be fatal. You can urge this through rule number 27. Likewise, remember rule number 29, which talks about the right to file what is called a paper, or I'm sorry, additional evidences. Now, every additional evidence is to be accompanied by a petition in terms of Rule 27, and the tribunal may, if it finds it fit, admit the additional evidences. The evidences that are already before the lower authorities are not filed in terms of Rule 29 as additional evidence, but are filed in terms of what is called a paper book, and that paper book must certify which are the papers which are before which lower authority. These papers are before AO, these papers are before CIT appeal, should be certified should be certified when you file a paper book. So there is something separate called a paper book, which comprises of evidences which are before the lower authorities. There is something called additional evidence. An additional evidence which is material or evidences which are not before the lower authorities. You should always have a prayer for admission of additional evidence. The same rules that I told you in respect of the commission appeal will apply. But if you see commission appeal, rule 46A of the income tax rules provides 4 circumstances where the additional evidences can be admitted, but rule 29 of the appellate tribunal rules say where the tribunal deems it fit to admit such additional evidence. So the prayer should be appropriately made to say why it is fit to admit the additional evidence, why it could not be produced before the lower. We were talking about a cross objection. We were talking about, the aspect relating to rule 27, where somebody could, argue that the order of the lower authority is correct, even where he is taking a fresh or new argument. Even where he is taking a fresh or new argument. Now, when I say this, you have to be a little wary about what happens in certain circumstances. Now, you will also remember that there are limits, what you call tax effect cases, when the revenue is presenting appeal before the higher authorities. Presently, for the revenue to present an appeal before the tribunal, there must be a tax effect of 50 lakh. To the High Court, there must be a tax effect of 1 crore. And to the Supreme Court, there must be a tax effect of 2 crore for the revenue to present an appeal. Please remember that this does not apply to an SSC. This applies only for revenue appeals, and the board circular itself says there are certain exceptions to these cases and lists out under what exceptions appeals can be presented even though the tax effect is lower than the limits that we just discussed. Remember that these tax effect limits are with regard to the tax, and tax here means without taking into account interest. Without taking into account interest. So first of all, calculate. If the tax effect is lesser, you can have the appeal disposed of or dismissed, the revenues appeal dismissed by saying tax effect is lesser than the limit. Likewise, for penalty, the limit is to be computed based on the quantum of penalty that is sought to be disputed. And you can say that revenue cannot come in appeal in certain cases. But I was talking about a cross objection. And I said a cross objection itself is deemed to be an appeal and shall be disposed of accordingly. A cross objection shall be deemed to be an appeal and shall be disposed of accordingly. Now, I had one interesting case where what happened was the department presented an appeal. Or rather, I'll start here. The assessing officer made 2 additions. The SC went to appeal against both the additions. The commission appeal allowed addition number 1 but held against SC in addition number 2. The SC decided that he will not file further appeal against the addition that has been upheld. The revenue, however, chose to file an appeal in respect of the appeal that had been held on the ground that had been held against them. When that came up for hearing before the tribunal, we had filed a cross objection saying that the other ground which has been held against SC has been wrongly held against SC. The matter came up before tribunal. We pointed out that the department's appeal will fail because of tax effect, because the tax effect was less than 50 lakh. The tribunal agreed that the appeal of the revenue will not lie or will not be maintainable because the tax effect was less than 50 lakh. However, when it came to the cross objection, the department said, then the cross objection is also not maintainable because the appeal is not maintainable. We said the right of filing a cross objection arises the minute an appeal is presented. Okay. It is not dependent on whether that appeal is maintainable. The presentation of the appeal gives me the right to file a cross objection. And then the law proceeds to say the cross objection shall be disposed of as though it were an appeal. So now you presented an appeal. That appeal may not be maintainable. Though it is not maintainable, you presented an appeal, I filed a cross objection. And once I file a cross objection, that cross objection itself is now deemed to be an appeal and is to be disposed of accordingly. Only difference is no fee. So we said this has to be disposed of accordingly. And the bench held that the cross objection could be decided independently and can be held in favor of SC or against SC. In fact, as luck would have it, it was held in favor of SC also in this case. So, if the department had kept quiet, both of us would not have filed appeal. At least what was held against me would have gone as held against me. They filed an appeal unnecessarily, which gave me the right to file what is called a cross objection. I filed a cross objection. And now I got both of these in my favor, because as far as the first issue is concerned, department appeal was held non-maintainable. As far as the second issue was concerned, the cross objection was allowed in my favor. So cross objection can be a very, very powerful tool, but I repeat, no cross objection can or need to be filed when a ground is when there is no ground that has been held against SSC, or when there remains no ground that has been adjudicated. Now, one other very important rule that has to be borne in mind as far as the appellate tribunal is concerned is rule number 10. Rule 10 of the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal rules. Rule 10 of the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal rules provides. Rule 10 of the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal rules provides that if an appeal is presented and if there are any facts that are contrary to records which are found in the assessment or the appellate order, or to say, put it in other words, in the order of the lower authorities, then an affidavit is to be filed in terms of Rule 10, stating what is contrary to the facts and what the correct facts are. I repeat, if there is a fact which is there in the order of the lower authorities which is contrary to facts, then an affidavit in terms of Rule 10 has to be filed before the appellate tribunal, stating what are the facts that are contrary to record and what are the correct facts. And if that is not countered by the department, whatever are the contents of the affidavit are presumed to be the correct facts. In fact, there is a classic decision of the Chennai tribunal in a case called Mohan Breweries and Distilleries Limited. The SC filed an affidavit in terms of Rule 10, which was not countered by the department. And the tribunal said, since it is not countered by the department, whatever is there is true. In fact, that decision in Mohan Breweries and Distilleries Limited, which in short is called MEDL, has been affirmed by the Madras High Court also. So, one has to be extremely careful to read each and every line of the lower authorities to see that nothing on the facts stated by the lower authorities is contrary to the correct facts which are available on record. If it is so, those facts must be appropriately stated in the Rule 10 affidavit. Now, talking about the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, the Commission of Appeal, etc., there were certain aspects that I consciously left out even as I was talking about the Commission. Remember that you are talking about an appellate right or an appellate authority's powers. Now, as far as the Commission of Appeal is concerned, the powers are to enhance, to annul, to set aside, or to cancel the assessment, or to confirm this. Now, as far as the tribunal is concerned, the tribunal does not have the power of enhancement, but has the power of set aside, which power is not available to the commissioner. That is remitting the matter back to the file of the assessing officer, or for that matter, the file of the Commission of Appeal to redo the assessment or the appeal as the case may be. Right? So, remember that these are the basic powers. But then, there are certain inherent powers that are available with the appellate authorities. Now, before we proceed to discuss about the power of stay, which is available with the appellate authorities, remember that Section 220 of the Income Tax Act provides that the assessing officer himself may either grant installments or grant stay. These are provided for in sections 220 subsection 3 and 220 subsection 6 of the Income Tax. These are provided for in sections 220 subsection 3 and 220 subsection 6 of the Income Tax. Now, when you want to have a stay from the assessing officer, he does not stay the proceedings but stays the recovery, the coercive steps of recovery. So it is that you are still at liberty to pay the taxes if you so wish, only that coercive steps will not be taken against you for the payment of the tax or interest. Now what happens is that if you will see the decision of the Madras High Court in a case called Paulson's Litho Works. Paulson's Litho Works, the Madras High Court. The Madras High Court says that the Commission of Appeal has got the inherent power to grant stay. The Commission of Appeal has got the inherent power to grant stay. Now, one more aspect you will remember is the board instruction, where they say that if the assessee pays 20% of the disputed tax and interest, then no coercive step should be taken. Unfortunately, if you will recall, the then finance minister, who is no more now, Arun Jaitley, said at that time, if you pay 15% of the disputed amount of tax and interest, no coercive steps will be taken. Later on, revised to 20%. He said, if you do this, we will not take coercive steps. Unfortunately, the assessing officers are now interpreting, saying you must pay 20%, then only we will grant stay, which is not a correct proposition at all. Which is not a correct proposition at all. But unfortunately, that is what is happening. And if that happens, your only right is your right in a writ petition. But remember that the Commission of Appeal also has the inherent right to grant or power to grant stay, and this is clearly provided for in the decision of the Madras High Court in a case called Paulson's Litho Works. In a case called Paulson's Litho Works, where the Madras High Court has held that the power to grant stay is an inherent power on the Commission of Appeal. So you can always approach the Commission of Appeal for grant of stay. So A, you may approach the assessing officer for grant of stay in terms of section 220 of the Income Tax Act. You may approach the Commissioner of Income Tax, the Principal Commissioner of Income Tax, whom I call the Administrative Commissioner, for grant of stay, because he has the administrative power to direct the assessing officer to grant stay. That is an administrative power. You may also approach the Commissioner of Appeal for grant of stay in terms of the decision of the Madras High Court in Paulson's. Now, the tribunal too has the power to grant stay. The tribunal too has the power to grant stay. But remember that in so far as the tribunal is concerned, there are some restrictions that are being placed by the Income Tax Act. Though I may not be in agreement with placing restrictions on the tribunal in its power to grant stay, unfortunately, the law has been tampering with the power of the tribunal to grant stay. They are saying that the tribunal's power to grant stay can only be for 180 days, and they can grant stay again, but it shall not exceed 365 days in all. And two, the Finance Act 2020 has made a very dangerous amendment to say that the power of the tribunal to grant stay is restricted only to a case where the assessee pays 20% of the disputed demand. 20% of the disputed demand, or provides adequate security, for payment of 20% of the disputed demand. Otherwise, the tribunal cannot grant stay. This is very, to my mind, not a very appropriate amendment. I don't want to say that it is a bad amendment. I don't want to use such language, but it is a very inappropriate amendment. An appellate authority, in my opinion, should have an inherent power to grant stay. See, what is the point in, let us say there is a company, you raise a frivolous demand of 100 crore on the company, and you say now pay 20 crores. Now, if I pay 20 crores, I have to close my business. I will not be able to pay wages for tomorrow, for the next month. Now, even at the cost of paying wages, if you want me to pay the 20 crores to avail of my appellate remedy, I think that's a very unfair proposition. That should never be there, and such a restriction should never have been placed in my opinion. There are a couple of other aspects that you must remember. If you are filing an appeal where the person is deceased and or where the person is not in existence, then if the order has been passed on the deceased or on a person who is not in existence, the appeal has to be presented by the appropriate person. So if the order is on the deceased and if the son wants to file an appeal, he should file it in his capacity as legal heir. Of course, all the legal heirs together may authorize one person to file the appeal also, for which they give an authorization to any one person. Or each and every legal heir has a right to file appeal because he is an aggrieved person. Likewise, a person not in existence, an amalgamating company, an amalgamated company. The amalgamated company may present the appeal because the liability to tax may lie on the amalgamated company. So one has to remember that the appeal has to be presented by the aggrieved person. So the successor, like the amalgamated company or the legal heir, may present the appeal. I'll just deal with one aspect and pause for a moment for some time, just so that we have questions. My session is supposed to conclude around 6, so we'll have about 5-10 minutes for question answers, but I will proceed to discuss one other aspect particularly. Now, you all are aware of the fact that a commissioner appeal has the power to rectify a mistake apparent on record in terms of section 154. If you go to 154, it says the assessing officer, any income tax authority may suo motu or an application from the SSE, or a commissioner appeal may suo motu or an application from the SSE or from the assessing officer rectify a mistake apparent on the record. So the commissioner appeal has the power to rectify a mistake apparent on the record. So I would always suggest that if there is a mistake apparent, you may take that in your ground of appeal before tribunal, but also file a rectification petition before commissioner. Likewise, if the commissioner has failed to adjudicate a particular ground, you may file a 154 before the commissioner appeal, and also you may file a 154 before the commissioner appeal, and also raise the same through grounds of appeal if you consider it appropriate, which is what I would do in such circumstances. Now, as far as tribunal is concerned, they also have the power to rectify the mistake apparent record. Unfortunately, they have restricted the time available to the tribunal. Please remember, tribunal also, like the commissioner appeal, does not have the power of review, but has the power to rectify any mistake which is apparent on the record. So if there is an order of the commission, the tribunal which suffers from mistake apparent on record, you may file what is called a miscellaneous petition or a miscellaneous application before the tribunal, which has to be filed within 6 months from the end of the month in which the order is passed, 6 months from the end of the month in which the order is passed, and thereafter the tribunal may, if it finds that there is a mistake apparent on the record, rectify the same, and thereafter the rectified order shall have effect. So even if grounds are not adjudicated, it constitutes a mistake apparent on record, a miscellaneous application or a miscellaneous petition. Now, friends, I think we have been discussing about various aspects for close to 2 hours now, and it has been a monologue almost virtually, because I'm not saying that any of you are to blame. I myself should be to blame for that. Well, if there are any questions at this stage, maybe we will take it.
Yes, sir.
Madam, take over.
Yes, sir. Yes. So one query raised by Srinivasan, sir. I'll just read out, sir. Read out the chat session questions. Yeah.
Yes.
When and how we can demand a remand report from the assessing officer, and what evidence or records we have to present before Commissioner of CIT appeals. Can I repeat?
There is no question of demand. Your question is over, madam. There is no question of demanding a remand report. Basically, when there is an evidence which is not being furnished before the assessing officer, such evidence can be furnished along with the petition under Rule 46A before the commissioner appeal. And I told you there are 4 circumstances in which additional evidences are admissible. The Commissioner appeal on receipt of such additional evidence may call for a remand report from the assessing officer. So it is the duty of the Commissioner appeal to call for the remand report. It is not that we can demand for remand report. But in every case where additional evidence is presented by an assessee, 46A3 requires that the Commissioner appeal should call for a remand report before placing reliance on such evidence. If he chooses to ignore the evidence, is a different thing altogether. But if he wants to place reliance on that evidence which you have produced, he will call for a remand report under Rule 46A.
Okay, sir. One more question, sir. Is it need to file the hard copy of Form 35 to the Commissioner of Income Tax Appeals Office? This is the question, sir.
Form 35 is now only to be uploaded. It doesn't have to be filed in a hard copy. There is no need to file a hard copy before the Commissioner appeal at all. But for convenience sake, at the time of the hearing, most of the Commissioner appeals are saying, give me a hard copy. That is for convenience sake, because unfortunately, if you see the soft copy, there is not even a ground number. The grounds are there, but grounds are not numbered. So the hard copy, they have a numbered ground so that they can dispose it of accordingly. That is more for convenience, but there is no mandate in law to file a hard copy thereof.
Okay, sir. Sir M. Lakshmanan, sir, you can ask your query, sir. You can speak directly speak to the speaker. Lakshmanan, sir, are you online? 1 second, sir. Lakshmanan, sir, you can unmute the audio. Okay, sir, I think he is not in online. I'll go for the next question. One minute, sir. Srinivasan, sir, you have raised your hands. I'll unmute the audio. Is it audible, sir? So I think the questions are, one speaker has lost the connection, I think. One participant. Okay, so I think the questions are, we don't have more questions, sir. Now I request Manimeghale Madam, Treasurer, to propose vote of thanks. Hello. Madam, is it audible? Yes, yes, madam, you can go ahead. Yeah. Madam, your voice is not audible. Sorry, sir. I think we'll end up the session, sir. She couldn't connect it online. And thank you, sir. Thank you for the elaborate session. And speaking in online is, as a speaker, it is very tough by seeing the system. I can understand it. But thank you for spending your valuable time, sir, in spending this 2 hours. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. We hope once the Corona lockdown has been over, we are expecting for the physical meeting also for the Madurai branch.
I'd love to come, man. I'd love to come to your temple town.
Okay, okay, sir. Always you are welcome, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.